Get that eyesore off this street. Patricia Wellington's voice cuts through the peaceful Charleston evening like a knife. She stands in her designer suit, pointing a manicured finger at Frank Thompson's cherished 1965 Ford Mustang. This isn't some rural junkyard, Mr. Thompson. This is Magnolia Gardens. Frank Thompson, age 60, grips his cane tighter as he faces the woman who's been terrorizing him for weeks. His silver hair catches the glow of the setting sun, and despite his trembling hands, his voice remains steady. This car was my wife's pride and joy, Mrs. Wellington. Anne and I restored it together over 38 years of marriage. She picked this cherry red color herself. But Patricia isn't interested in memories or emotions. She waves a stack of papers in the air. I don't care if Henry Ford himself gave you this car. I'm the head of the Neighborhood Enhancement Committee, and I say it goes. Now! Behind her, a tow truck idles menacingly, its yellow lights casting ominous shadows across the peaceful street. The driver looks uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot as he watches the confrontation unfold. Please. Frank's voice cracks slightly. This is all I have left of her. Anne passed last spring, and... Oh, spare me the sob story, Patricia interrupts, gesturing to the tow truck driver. Get it done. But as the driver takes a step forward, something remarkable happens. Doors begin opening up and down the street. Porch lights flick on, and one by one, Frank's neighbors emerge from their homes. This is the story of how one man's fight to preserve his memories turned into a community's stand against bullying. It's a tale about dignity, respect, and the true meaning of neighborhood. Most importantly, it's about discovering that family isn't always who you're related to. Sometimes it's the people who stand beside you when everyone else tries to make you back down. Tell us where you're watching from in the comments, and hit subscribe if you're against bullying and mistreatment. Magnolia Gardens, Charleston, South Carolina, was known for its sprawling oak trees and historic homes. On Oak Haven Street lived Frank Thompson, a 60-year-old retired auto mechanic whose skilled hands had brought countless engines back to life during his 40-year career at Thompson's classic car repair. Living alone in his modest brick ranch house, Frank was what his neighbors called a true Southern gentleman. His silver hair was always neatly combed back, his clothes pressed despite their age, and his kind eyes carried both warmth and sadness. 8 months ago, he had lost Anne, his wife of 38 years, to cancer. Their love story had been simple but beautiful. They met when she brought her father's broken-down Mustang to Frank's shop in 1985. That same Mustang now sat in Frank's driveway, its cherry red paint gleaming in the Charleston sun. The 1965 Ford Mustang had become more than just a car. It was a living memorial to their love. Anne had chosen the color herself, saying it matched the roses Frank brought her on their first date. Every Saturday for decades they had worked on it together, her laughter mixing with the sounds of tools and old country music from their garage radio. Good morning, beautiful, Frank would say each day, not just to the car, but to Anne's memory. His morning ritual was well known in the neighborhood. At 7 a.m. sharp, he would emerge with his coffee in a faded Charleston Motors mug, spend an hour tending to the Mustang, then share breakfast with his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Elena Rodriguez, whose Cuban coffee and stories about her late husband, Alberto, made the mornings less lonely. Across the street lived James Johnson, a Vietnam veteran whose own appreciation for classics extended beyond cars to the military medals displayed proudly in his window. The three seniors had formed their own little family, looking out for each other in a neighborhood that was rapidly changing around them. Magnolia Gardens had recently become popular with wealthy newcomers from up north, drawn by Charleston's historic charm and growing reputation as a luxury destination. Modern homes were replacing the old ones, and perfectly manicured lawns were becoming the norm rather than Mrs. Rodriguez's wild and wonderful garden of native plants. The latest arrival was Patricia Wellington, recently moved from New York City. She had purchased the grand Victorian house 3 doors down, immediately beginning extensive renovations that filled the peaceful street with construction noise. Patricia quickly made her presence known, attending every community meeting and suggesting changes to enhance property values. Frank first noticed her one morning as he was waxing the Mustang. She stood at the edge of his property, designer handbag on her arm, scrutinizing his beloved car with the kind of look usually reserved for something unpleasant found on the bottom of one's shoe. Little did Frank know that this moment would mark the beginning of a battle that would test not just his resolve, but the very spirit of the community he called home. Frank first noticed her one morning as he was waxing the Mustang. She stood at the edge of his property, designer handbag on her arm, scrutinizing his beloved car with the kind of look usually reserved for something unpleasant found on the bottom of one's shoe. However, Frank was too absorbed in his morning ritual to pay her much attention. Anne had always joked that he spoke to the car more than he spoke to her. Now, 8 months after her passing, these morning conversations with the Mustang were his way of keeping her memory alive. "Looking good today, old girl," he murmured, buffing a spot on the hood. Anne would say we're both aging like fine wine. The sharp click of heels on pavement interrupted his reverie. Patricia Wellington stood at the edge of his driveway, designer sunglasses perched on her nose, tablet in hand. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone used to getting their way. "I'm conducting a neighborhood audit. We're documenting all potential violations of community standards." Frank straightened slowly, his arthritis protesting the movement. "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Wellington. Would you care for some coffee?" Patricia ignored his offer, tapping at her tablet. "Your vehicle. How long has it been parked here?" "Oh, Ann and I bought her in '85. Been right here ever since, except for the occasional drive on sunny Sundays." "I see." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Mr. Thompson, Magnolia Gardens is an up-and-coming neighborhood. Property values are rising. We can't have," she gestured vaguely at the Mustang, "outdated elements bringing down the aesthetic appeal." Frank's grip tightened on his coffee mug. "This car is registered, insured, and maintained daily, Mrs. Wellington. She's part of this neighborhood's history." "History," Patricia scoffed, "is what we're trying to move beyond. You'll be receiving a formal notice about this situation." As she clicked away down the sidewalk, Frank felt a knot forming in his stomach. He'd seen that same determined look before, on the face of developers who tried to buy Anne's family farm, on real estate agents pushing them to modernize their home. From her porch next door, Mrs. Rodriguez called out in her warm Cuban accent, "Don't you worry, Frank. Some people don't understand that beauty isn't always about what's new and shiny." Frank smiled at his neighbor's words, but the comfort they usually brought felt hollow today. As he watched Patricia's retreating figure, he couldn't shake the feeling that the peaceful life he'd built on Oak Haven Street was about to change forever. True to Patricia Wellington's word, the notices began appearing the very next morning. Frank found the first one tucked under the Mustang's windshield wiper, a bright yellow paper with bold black letters. "Violation, non-conforming vehicle. Action required within 48 hours." 48 hours? Frank muttered, his hands trembling slightly as he read the notice. Who does she think she is? But this was just the beginning. Over the next week, Patricia launched what Mrs. Rodriguez called her campaign of terror. Every morning brought a new notice, each more strongly worded than the last. Property value hazard. Community standards violation. Final warning. One quiet Sunday afternoon, as Frank sat in his porch rocker watching the neighborhood children admire his Mustang from the sidewalk, he spotted Patricia marching up and down the street with her tablet. She was photographing not just his car, but everything she deemed undesirable. Mrs. Rodriguez's vibrant wildflower garden, Mr. Johnson's patriotic flag display, even old Mrs. Baker's handmade quilts airing on her front porch line. "Look at this," Patricia's voice carried across the street as she addressed a small group of newer residents. "This is exactly what's holding back property values in Magnolia Gardens. That car," she pointed dramatically at Frank's Mustang, "is just the tip of the iceberg. This neighborhood needs standards, rules, enforcement." Frank's grandson Tommy, visiting for the weekend, watched from the porch steps. "Grandpa, why don't you tell her to get lost?" "That's not how we handle things, Tommy," Frank replied, though his heart ached at seeing his beloved car treated like some kind of neighborhood menace. "Your grandmother always said dignity speaks louder than anger." But Patricia's campaign was far from over. She called an emergency neighborhood meeting at her newly renovated Victorian home, complete with printed agendas and a PowerPoint presentation titled Maintaining Property Values, a Guide to Community Excellence. Frank attended, sitting quietly in the back row with Mr. Johnson and Mrs. Rodriguez. The meeting room was packed, divided clearly between old and new residents. Patricia stood at the front, clicking through slides showing problem areas in the neighborhood. And here, she said, pulling up a photo of Frank's Mustang, is Exhibit A. A vintage vehicle, and not in the charming way. This kind of outdated fixture sends the wrong message about our community. Studies show that visible car restoration projects can decrease neighboring property values by up to 15%. Mr. Johnson's hand shot up. That's nonsense. Frank's Mustang is better maintained than your new Mercedes, Patricia. Mr. Johnson, Patricia replied with a condescending smile, while I appreciate your nostalgic attachment to these things, we need to think about the future. I propose new guidelines prohibiting visible restoration vehicles, requiring approval for any car over 10 years old parked in driveways, and establishing a committee which I will chair to enforce these standards. The room erupted in murmurs. Frank sat silently, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. Anne would have known exactly what to say, how to stand up to this woman without losing her grace. But Anne wasn't here. Mrs. Rodriguez stood up, her small frame straight with dignity. I came to this country with nothing but hope and my Alberto's dreams. We chose Magnolia Gardens because it had soul, character. Frank's car, my garden, James's flag. These aren't eyesores. They're the heart of our community. Several older residents applauded, but Patricia remained unmoved. Times change, Mrs. Rodriguez. Those who can't adapt get left behind. As Frank walked home that evening, he found another notice on his car. This one was different, printed on official-looking letterhead, 72-hour notice, unauthorized vehicle removal. His hands shook as he read the fine print. Patricia was planning to have his car towed. Over my dead body, he whispered, touching the small heart-shaped scratch near the driver's door where Anne's ring had caught the paint so many years ago. I promised you I'd take care of her, Anne, and I will. Little did Frank know, Patricia Wellington was already making calls to local towing companies, setting in motion a confrontation that would shake the foundations of their peaceful neighborhood. The next morning dawned with an unusual tension in the air. Frank woke earlier than usual, troubled by nightmares of Anne's car being taken away. As he stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand, he noticed Patricia standing on her lawn, speaking intently into her phone. Yes, that's right, her voice carried across the quiet morning air. A red 1965 Ford Mustang. I have all the necessary paperwork as HOA president. She caught Frank watching and turned away, lowering her voice. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he dialed his grandson's number. Tommy? Remember how you offered to help with those security cameras? I think it's time. That afternoon, while Frank was at his grandson's baseball game, the one weekly event that could pull him away from the Mustang, Patricia made her move. If it hadn't been for Mrs. Rodriguez's quick thinking, Frank might have lost everything. Dios mío. Frank, come home now. Mrs. Rodriguez's panicked voice came through his cell phone. That woman. She's here with a tow truck. Frank's heart nearly stopped. He could barely focus on driving as he rushed home, his old pickup truck protesting as he pushed it faster than usual. When he turned onto Oak Haven Street, the scene before him made his blood run cold. A massive tow truck was backing into his driveway, its yellow lights flashing. Patricia stood supervising, and a stack of papers clutched triumphantly in her manicured hands. But what brought tears to Frank's eyes was the sight of Mrs. Rodriguez, all 4 feet 11 inches of her, standing firmly between the truck and the Mustang, her garden rake held like a weapon. You take one more step toward this car, Mrs. Rodriguez was saying as Frank pulled up, and I'll show you what Cuban spirit really means. Officer Mike Henderson, a local beat cop who'd known Frank for years, was already there, summoned by concerned neighbors. He was examining Patricia's paperwork with a skeptical eye. Mrs. Wellington, Officer Henderson said, this HOA documentation, it's not valid. Magnolia Gardens HOA jurisdiction ends 3 streets over. You have no authority here. Patricia's face flushed red. That's ridiculous. I am the president of... You're not the president of anything in this section of the neighborhood, came a new voice. Barbara Matthews, the actual HOA president from 3 blocks over, stepped forward. She had been called by Mr. Johnson, who knew her from church, and I'd appreciate it if you'd stop claiming to be. The tow truck driver, already uncomfortable with the situation, quickly began packing up his equipment. "Sorry, ma'am," he said to Patricia, "but I can't tow without proper authorization. That'd be illegal." Patricia wasn't finished, though. Her eyes glittering with barely contained rage, she turned to Frank. "This isn't over, Mr. Thompson. That car is a blight on this neighborhood, and one way or another, it's going to go." "No, Patricia," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of decades of dignity. "The only blight here is the hatred you're bringing to our community. Anne and I built our life here, restored this car here, made memories here. I won't let you erase that." As Patricia stormed off, the gathered neighbors began to disperse. But something had changed. The battle lines had been drawn, and everyone knew this was just the beginning. That evening, as Frank sat on his porch with Mrs. Rodriguez and Mr. Johnson, sharing Cuban coffee and watching the sunset glint off the Mustang's chrome, his grandson Tommy showed him how to use the new security cameras he'd installed. "She won't catch us off guard again, Grandpa," Tommy assured him. Frank nodded, but his heart was heavy. He could feel in his bones that Patricia Wellington wasn't done yet. She'd been humiliated, her false authority exposed. In his 60 years, he'd learned that nothing was more dangerous than a bully with a wounded ego. The calm didn't last long. One morning, Frank found not just a notice, but an official-looking government letter in his mailbox. His hands shook as he read the contents, a formal eviction notice claiming his property was illegally obtained and that he had no right to live in Magnolia Gardens. According to the documentation, which bore official stamps and signatures, Frank's home purchase from 1985 had been fraudulent. There were property surveys, tax records, and even statements from previous owners claiming they had never sold the house to Frank and Anne. "This is impossible," Frank whispered, sinking into his porch chair. Every document about his home purchase, every memory of that proud day when he and Anne had gotten their keys, flashed through his mind. The next morning, 2 officials from the county assessor's office appeared at his door. "Mr. Thompson, we're here about some concerning documentation regarding your property ownership." What followed was a nightmare of bureaucracy. Frank found himself shuttling between government offices, clutching the yellowed papers from his original home purchase. At each office, he discovered new evidence had been filed against him, all mysteriously submitted by an anonymous, concerned citizen. "Don't give up, Frank," Mrs. Rodriguez urged, accompanying him to yet another appointment. "We all remember when you and Anne bought this house. We were at your housewarming party." Mr. Johnson wheeled himself into the county records office one day, carrying a photo album. "Look here," he told the officials, showing them pictures from 1985. Frank and Anne's housewarming, neighborhood barbecues, holiday gatherings. "These people have been part of our community for decades." But Patricia's web of lies was elaborate. She had somehow manufactured a paper trail suggesting the Thompsons had been squatting for years, taking advantage of a clerical error. She'd even hired people to pose as rightful owners of the property. The turning point came when Tommy, tech-savvy as ever, decided to deeper. "Grandpa, something's not right with these documents. The timestamps on these digital files, they were all created 2 weeks ago." Barbara Matthews, the real HOA president, brought in her husband, a retired forensic accountant. Together with Tommy, they began unraveling Patricia's scheme. They discovered money transfers to a document forger, emails to hired actors posing as previous owners, and most damning of all, a detailed plan to drive out not just Frank, but several other elderly residents to gentrify the neighborhood. Meanwhile, the community rallied. Neighbors who had lived in Magnolia Gardens for decades came forward with their own documentation. Photos, letters, even Super 8 films showing the Thompsons as integral parts of the community. Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter, now a lawyer in Charleston, took up Frank's case pro bono. The final blow to Patricia's scheme came from an unexpected source, her own hired document forger, who, faced with potential criminal charges, agreed to testify about her elaborate plan. "She paid me to create everything," he admitted to the investigators. "Property records, tax documents, even fake historical surveys. said she wanted to clean up the neighborhood by getting rid of the old elements. When the truth emerged, the backlash was swift. Patricia faced multiple criminal charges: fraud, forgery, harassment, and attempted property theft. The investigation revealed she'd done similar things in other neighborhoods before moving to Charleston. "You don't just mess with one of us," Mr. Johnson declared at a community meeting. "You mess with all of us." The county officially apologized to Frank, clearing his property records and ensuring such fraud couldn't happen again. But for Patricia, the consequences were severe. She was not only facing criminal charges, but was served with a community restraining order, forcing her to sell her Victorian house and leave Magnolia Gardens. As Patricia was escorted from her home by officers, her designer handbag replaced by a stack of legal papers, she caught sight of Frank sitting in his porch rocker, the Mustang gleaming in his driveway. The morning after Patricia Wellington's arrest, Oak Haven Street felt different. The heavy cloud of tension that had hung over the neighborhood for months had lifted, replaced by a gentle Charleston breeze carrying the scent of Mrs. Rodriguez's gardenias. Frank sat in his usual spot on the porch, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise glint off the Mustang's chrome. The sight of his car, still proudly parked in the driveway where he and Anne had first placed it in 1985, brought a peace he hadn't felt since her passing. "You wouldn't believe what happened, Anne," he whispered, a habit he'd developed over the past 9 months. "But you always said, truth has a way of coming to light." The neighborhood's recovery began slowly but beautifully. It started with Mrs. Rodriguez organizing a victory garden party in her backyard. Everyone brought food: her Cuban sandwiches, Mr. Johnson's famous Carolina barbecue, and even Mrs. Baker's prize-winning peach cobbler. Children played freely in the yards again, and several stopped by to admire Frank's Mustang, asking him questions about its history. "Tell us about the heart-shaped scratch again, Mr. Thompson," they'd beg, and Frank would share the story of Anne's ring catching the paint on their first drive home. The Victorian house that Patricia had so briefly occupied stood empty for a while, its for sale sign a reminder of darker days. But then something wonderful happened. A young couple, the Harrises, bought it. Their first act wasn't renovation. Instead, they asked Frank for advice about the historic property's original features they hoped to preserve. "We fell in love with this neighborhood because of its character," Lisa Harris told Frank. "All these beautiful old homes, the gardens, and especially your Mustang. It reminds us of my grandfather's car." Tommy's security cameras stayed up, but now they captured different moments: neighbors checking on each other, children admiring the Mustang, and community members coming together for impromptu evening gatherings on Frank's porch. The town council took notice of Magnolia Gardens' story. In a special session, they passed what became known as the Heritage Protection Act, ensuring that established residents couldn't be forced out through fraudulent means. They even designated Frank's Mustang as a historical community asset, protecting it from future interference. One warm Sunday afternoon, about 6 months after Patricia's departure, Frank hosted the neighborhood's first Classic Car Appreciation Day. He pulled the Mustang onto his front lawn, opened the hood, and spent hours teaching interested neighbors about the engine Anne had helped him restore. Mr. Johnson brought out his military medals, displaying them proudly next to the car, while Mrs. Rodriguez set up a table with refreshments and old photos of the neighborhood. "Anne would have loved this," Frank said to Mrs. Rodriguez as they watched Tommy teach some local kids about the Mustang's engine. "She's here, mi amigo," Mrs. Rodriguez replied softly, patting his hand. "In every gleam of chrome, every purr of that engine, and in the way you've helped bring this community together." The sun was setting on Oak Haven Street, casting long shadows across the lawns. The Mustang's cherry red paint glowed in the golden light, and somewhere in the distance, church bells chimed. Frank looked around at his neighbors, no, his family, and felt Anne's presence stronger than ever. "You were right, my love," he whispered. "Sometimes the greatest gifts come from standing your ground, not in anger, but in dignity and truth." And in that moment, as laughter and conversation filled the warm Charleston evening, Frank Thompson knew that while his beloved Anne might be gone, her spirit lived on. Not just in the Mustang they'd lovingly restored together, but in the heart